A rusty cage sat forgotten on a snowy city sidewalk. A handwritten sign above it read, "For sale." Inside, a German shepherd mother curled around her two shivering pups, their fur glazed with frost, their eyes too tired to cry. People walked past without looking twice, but one man stopped. A Navy SEAL in a worn uniform, a soldier who'd seen too much loss to ignore another. He knelt in the snow, face to face with the trembling mother, and something in both of them broke open and began to heal. What happened next will melt your heart and remind you that kindness is never for sale. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Winter mornings in New York had a strange kind of beauty, harsh, brittle, and fragile all at once. The snow that had fallen overnight still clung to rooftops and awnings, softening the hard edges of the city. Steam rose from the street vents, curling into the gray air, and the sound of distant traffic echoed like a heartbeat beneath the cold. Fifth Avenue was already alive with motion, the click of heels, the rhythm of hurried boots, the shuffle of a city that had no time to look down. Ethan Walker walked with no particular destination. He moved like a man accustomed to long roads and silence, tall, broad-shouldered, built from years of endurance rather than ease. His dark brown hair was short, touched faintly with gray, and a trimmed beard lined a jaw that looked carved from habit more than vanity. At 38, he still carried the posture of a Navy SEAL, though the uniform he wore, a faded Navy working uniform Type 3 in soft green-gray-brown camouflage, no longer represented command or mission, only memory. His eyes, a storm gray that caught the light of the city and reflected none of it, watched the world with quiet distance. Ethan had been home for 3 months, but the word home had lost its meaning. Every night, he dreamed of sandstorms, broken radios, and the sound of barking that never faded. Every morning, he woke to the hum of refrigerators and traffic instead of rotors and waves. It should have been peace, but peace could feel like another kind of exile. So he walked, through the frost and noise and movement, just to remember that he still could. It was near East 72nd Street that he saw it, a metal cage sitting crookedly beside a lamppost, half buried in snow. At first, he thought it was trash, something left behind by a street vendor or careless mover. But as he drew closer, he saw the sign taped across the top, written in thick black marker, "For sale." He stopped. The cage was small, rusted along the corners, the bars frosted white with ice. Inside was a German shepherd mother, curled tight around 2 tiny puppies. Her fur, once thick and glossy, was dulled by dirt and weather. She trembled, though her body remained wrapped protectively around her young. The puppies pressed into her chest, their small bodies barely moving except for the faint rise and fall of breath. For a long moment, Ethan simply stared. People passed behind him, boots crunching, phones ringing, voices clipped by the cold. No one slowed. No one looked. The city flowed around the small cage as though it were invisible. A woman in a long red coat muttered, "Poor thing," but didn't stop. Ethan felt a hollow ache in his chest. It wasn't anger, not yet, just recognition. He had seen that look before. A living creature waiting for help that never came. It was the same expression he'd seen on the faces of stray dogs on deployment. The same one in the mirror after the funerals of friends. He crouched beside the cage, the movement natural, precise. The dog stiffened, ears twitching, body coiled to protect. Ethan kept his hands visible and his tone calm. "Hey there," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "Easy, it's all right." The mother's eyes lifted to meet his. They were a deep, glassy brown, ringed with red from cold and exhaustion. Her breathing was shallow, fogging the air between them. She didn't growl, only stared, measuring him with the same cautious patience he once used to clear rooms in silence. He studied the collar around her neck, thin nylon, torn at the edges, too tight. Whoever left her had done so with purpose. He imagined the moment, the car door slamming, the taillights disappearing, the sound of wind filling the space where loyalty once lived. Above the street, 6 stories up, Eleanor Pierce sat by her frost-lined window. 70 years old, hair silver and soft as dust, she had a small, tidy apartment filled with books and photographs that smelled faintly of tea leaves. Once, she'd been an English teacher at a neighborhood high school. Now she spent her days watching the street below, her world reduced to the rhythm of strangers' footsteps. Since her husband Richard, a Vietnam veteran with gentle hands and haunted eyes, had died 10 years ago, winter had always felt longer. From her window, Eleanor saw the man pause at the cage. She watched as he knelt, the movement slow and deliberate, like someone lowering himself into memory. Something about his posture struck her, the straightness of his back, the careful stillness of his hands. She knew that stillness. She'd seen it in Richard when he came home from war, when words had become something fragile, something easily broken. On the street, Ethan exhaled softly. "Who left you out here, huh?" he whispered. The words came out as breath, not sound. The dog tilted her head slightly. He removed one glove and reached toward the cage, not to touch, just to let her smell his hand. His skin stung in the cold. "It's okay," he said again. "I'm not going to hurt you." The German Shepherd's nose twitched. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, she leaned forward and sniffed his fingers through the bars. The gesture was small, but it broke something inside him. A wall he hadn't realized was still standing. Her trust was tentative, fragile, undeserved, and yet she gave it anyway. A bus roared past, shaking the pavement. Snow fluttered from a nearby awning and landed across Ethan's shoulders, melting into the fabric of his jacket. He didn't move. The world went on, but for him, the noise faded to nothing. He looked at her pups, 2 tiny shapes pressed beneath their mother's chest. One whimpered softly, the sound barely audible above the city's hum. The mother nudged it with her muzzle, a quiet, instinctive motion. Ethan's throat tightened. Above, Eleanor leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. She whispered to herself, without knowing why, "Don't let her freeze." Ethan's hand rested on the cage, his fingertips brushing cold metal. He could feel the pulse of warmth behind it, the faint promise of life holding on. "You've been fighting too long," he said under his breath. The German Shepherd blinked slowly. Their eyes met, gray to brown, human to animal, survivor to survivor. In that instant, the sounds of Fifth Avenue vanished. The horns, the footsteps, the conversations, all fell away. The snow drifted softly between them like falling ash, and the only thing that existed was that silent exchange of understanding. Ethan felt something stir deep within him, a memory of loyalty, of loss, of the quiet instinct to protect what cannot protect itself. He didn't move closer, didn't speak again. He simply stayed there, kneeling in the snow, his breath mingling with the dog's, his heart steadying for the first time in months. And in that quiet, beneath the gray sky of a city too loud to notice, Ethan's eyes met the wet, trembling eyes of the German Shepherd mother. A single, wordless moment hung between them. Fragile, still, and strangely sacred. A moment of silence in the middle of the noise. The snow had started falling harder now, the flakes growing heavier and slower as they drifted past the glow of the streetlights. The world looked washed in silver, quiet except for the distant growl of a taxi engine somewhere down Fifth Avenue. Ethan stayed crouched beside the cage, the wind tugging at his jacket. The German Shepherd mother hadn't looked away from him once. Her eyes followed his every breath, and for a moment he forgot that there was anyone else in the city but the two of them and the trembling life she shielded with her body. He straightened and turned, scanning the sidewalk. Just across the street, a man in a thick brown parka was tending to a small cart half buried under a sheet of snow. The faint smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through the air. Ethan walked toward him, his boots crunching softly. The vendor, a man perhaps in his late 50s, short, sturdy, with a broad face reddened by the cold, looked up as Ethan approached. "Hey," Ethan said, nodding toward the cage. "That cage by the tree. Do you know who left it there?" The vendor frowned, his breath clouding the air. "What cage?" he asked, wiping his gloved hands on a towel. Then he followed Ethan's gaze and saw it. "Ah, that thing's been there since morning, maybe earlier. I figured somebody'd come back for it, but no one did." His voice carried the indifference of a man who'd seen too much of the city to be surprised by its cruelty. "You didn't see anyone with the dogs?" The man shook his head. "No, just people passing by. Most don't even look." He shrugged and turned back to his cart. "Happens all the time. You can't save every stray in New York." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His gloved fingers brushed the snow off the edge of his jacket as he turned back toward the cage. When he reached it again, the snow had nearly covered the sign, "For sale." The edges of the cardboard curled from moisture, the ink bleeding down the sides. He crouched once more, brushing away the snow so the mother dog could see his face. Her body was trembling harder now, her breath quick and shallow. The smallest puppy made a faint sound, barely a whimper, its tiny paw twitching. "Easy," Ethan murmured. "Hang on, girl, I've got you." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. It was old, scuffed leather, soft at the edges. Inside were a few folded bills and a military ID. He looked down at the money for a long moment, his last cash until his next disability check. A bitter laugh caught in his throat. "Figures," he muttered quietly. He turned toward the vendor again. "Hey," he called over the wind. "I'll give you 2 20s for that cage." The man blinked. "For what?" "For the cage," Ethan said simply, "and everything inside it." The vendor stared at him for a second, then shrugged. "Buddy, it's not mine." "I know," Ethan said, "but take it anyway. I just don't want anyone else touching them." The vendor studied him for a moment, his expression softening. There was something about the man's tone, steady, weary, and absolute, that didn't invite argument. He nodded. "All right, pal, if it makes you feel better." Ethan handed him the money, not waiting for thanks. He turned back to the cage and crouched down again. "You're coming with me," he said softly, almost to himself. Above, Eleanor Pierce watched through her frost-blurred window. She had put down her tea long ago, her hands now pressed against the glass, as if by leaning closer, she could somehow step into that scene. The man's posture, the quiet determination in his shoulders, it was too familiar. Her late husband, Richard, used to stand that same way whenever he decided something his heart couldn't let go. He had been a kind man, quiet but strong, who once brought home a limping dog from the Bronx and spent a week sleeping beside it on the kitchen floor until it trusted him. Watching the stranger below, Eleanor felt that same ache in her chest, the one that always came when memory and the present began to blur. On the street, Ethan gripped the cage handle. It was heavier than it looked, the metal stiff with ice. The mother dog lifted her head as the cage shifted, her body curling tighter around her puppies in alarm. "It's all right," Ethan said, voice firm but gentle. "You're safe now." He carried the cage carefully toward the curb, boots sinking into the snow. His truck was parked half a block away, an old blue pickup with salt-streaked doors and a cracked windshield. Every step left deep prints in the snow, filled instantly by the falling flakes. As he walked, a woman stepped out of a nearby cafe holding a steaming cup of coffee. She was in her 30s, tall and neatly dressed, with dark hair tucked under a knit hat. Her name, though Ethan wouldn't learn it until later, was Sarah Ling, the cafe's owner. She had kind eyes, but a guarded expression, the look of someone who had built her life around control after years of chaos. Her father had been a doctor who volunteered in hurricane zones, and she had inherited both his compassion and his stubbornness. She froze for a moment when she saw the man carrying the cage. "Oh my God," she said, stepping closer. "Are those puppies in this weather?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah." "Where did you—" She stopped when she saw his face. Calm, distant, the kind of expression that didn't invite conversation. "Do you need help?" He hesitated. "No, ma'am. I've got them." Sarah studied him for a second, something like recognition flickering in her eyes, the way strangers sometimes see a story they don't know how to ask about. She nodded. "I'll get some blankets," she said quickly, and disappeared back inside. When she returned, she carried 2 thick wool blankets and a paper cup. "Here," she said, handing them over. "For them. And maybe for you too." Ethan accepted both with a small nod. "Thank you." She smiled faintly. "Take care of them, all right?" "I will," he said. His voice was quiet but certain, like an oath. Eleanor watched as the man disappeared into the falling snow, the cage in his arms, the blanket draped over it like a flag. Something inside her softened, a strange, gentle warmth spreading through her chest. She whispered, "That's exactly what Richard would have done." Ethan reached his truck, set the cage down beside the door, and brushed the snow from his hair. The mother dog looked up at him, her eyes glistening, one paw resting protectively over her smallest pup. "Almost there," he said softly, and lifted the cage into the back of the truck. The metal scraped against the tailgate before settling with a dull thud. He stood for a moment, catching his breath, watching as the snow thickened around him. The lights from the cafe cast a faint amber glow across the street, illuminating the trail of his footprints that led straight from the cage to the truck, each one deep and deliberate, a map of quiet resolve. Ethan pulled the blanket tighter over the cage, then closed the tailgate with a soft click. For a moment, he just stood there, listening to the wind, to the muffled hum of traffic, to the fragile rhythm of 3 small lives behind him. He climbed into the driver's seat, glanced once more into the rearview mirror, and saw the faint outline of the mother dog watching him. Then he exhaled slowly, shifted into gear, and drove away through the curtain of falling snow, leaving only a line of footprints sinking deeper into the white behind him. Snow still clung to the cuffs of Ethan's trousers by the time he reached his small apartment in Brooklyn. The neighborhood was quiet, a patchwork of aging brick buildings and narrow streets half buried under slush. The lights from the windows were dim and yellow, flickering behind curtains that hadn't been changed in years. His breath rose in clouds as he pushed open the door of the 3-room walk-up, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was cold enough to make his fingers ache. He set the cage down on an old wool rug near the heater, a relic from the 1980s that rattled and hummed but never truly warmed the room. The German Shepherd mother pressed herself into one corner of the cage, trembling but alert, her eyes tracking every move he made. The 2 puppies lay in a small heap against her chest, breathing fast and shallow. Ethan knelt beside them, fingers stiff as he unlatched the cage. "Easy," he whispered. "You're safe now." The words came out quietly, almost as if meant for himself. He lifted the mother dog first. She was lighter than she looked, ribs sharp under her fur, a small cut visible above her left paw. When he touched her, she didn't fight. She just exhaled, her head lowering in exhaustion. He wrapped her in a blanket, then one by one lifted the puppies out. Their bodies were warm to the touch, but too still, the kind of stillness that made his pulse quicken. The apartment was sparsely furnished, a narrow bed against one wall, a small stove, and a single armchair with stuffing poking from the seams. The only decoration was a wooden cross that hung crookedly above the door, and a photograph of Ethan and his old SEAL team. 6 men, standing in desert light, smiles caught somewhere between pride and fatigue. He had avoided looking at that picture for months. Tonight, it felt like another life entirely. He filled a pot with water, his movements automatic, and set it on the stove. The faint hiss of the flame broke the silence. He found a half-empty bag of rice and a tin of canned ham, the closest thing to a meal he could offer. The scent of it began to fill the air, mild and comforting. Behind him, the dog stirred. The German Shepherd mother stood unsteadily, her tail low but moving faintly. Ethan could see that she was still young, perhaps 3 years old, no more. Her fur, now drying near the heater, revealed a rich pattern of black and tan, though dull from neglect. Her eyes followed him wherever he went, wary but softening. "You're tougher than you look," he murmured, crouching beside her again. He reached out, palm open. She sniffed his hand, and then, after a long pause, pressed her nose gently into his wrist. The gesture sent a faint warmth through him that had nothing to do with the heater. He checked her paw and cleaned the wound with a damp cloth. "You'll be fine," he said, almost smiling. "You made it this far." When the rice porridge was ready, he poured a small bowl and mashed some meat into it, setting it down near them. The mother dog hesitated only a moment before eating, slowly and neatly. Then when she was done, she nudged the bowl toward her puppies. The smaller one, barely half the size of its sibling, crawled clumsily forward and began to lap at the food. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He sat back on the floor, watching them. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt full. He leaned his head against the wall and said quietly, "Hope, Scout, Tiny." He pointed as he spoke. first to the mother, then the bolder pup, then the frail one. That's you three. The names fit. The mother lifted her head, as if acknowledging her new identity, while the two pups squirmed together in the blanket, their bellies round now. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Snow tapped softly against the glass. Ethan stirred the pot again, more out of habit than hunger. He wasn't used to company. The cabin-like loneliness of the place had once been his refuge. Now, it seemed smaller, warmer. Several floors above, the faint sound of a door closing reached his ears. In this building, sound traveled like gossip. He ignored it at first, but then came the gentle, hesitant knock on his door. He frowned and opened it halfway. Standing in the hallway was Eleanor Pierce, bundled in a long beige coat, her silver hair tucked under a knitted hat. In her hands, she carried a small pot covered with a towel to keep in the heat. Her cheeks were pink from the wind. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she began, her voice warm but unsure. "I live in 6A. One of the neighbors said a former serviceman moved in recently. And, well, when I saw you earlier on 5th Avenue, I thought perhaps it was you." She paused, glancing down at the pot. "I made chicken soup. You look like someone who could use a bit of warmth." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "You were watching from the window." Eleanor smiled faintly. "At my age, the world comes to me through glass." He hesitated, then stepped aside. "Please, come in." The older woman entered slowly, her eyes scanning the small apartment. When she saw the 3 dogs by the heater, her hand went to her chest. "Oh my." Her voice softened. "They're beautiful." "They're hungry," Ethan said simply. Eleanor set the pot down on the counter. "Well, so are you, I imagine." She looked around for a bowl, found one, and ladled out a portion for him. "Eat while it's still warm. It's not much, but it'll help." Ethan accepted it silently. The first spoonful burned his tongue, but it was the best thing he'd tasted in months. "Thank you," he said finally. Eleanor crouched near the puppies, her knees creaking. One of them, Scout, tumbled toward her foot, tiny paws splaying on the floorboards. She laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Hello there," she said, lifting the pup gently. "You're quite the explorer, aren't you?" The mother dog watched, but didn't move. Her ears flicked once, then relaxed. Eleanor's laughter faded into a smile. "I haven't heard myself laugh like that in a long time," she admitted. Ethan looked at her, at the deep lines on her face, at the eyes that still carried warmth despite the years. "You must have had dogs before," he said. "Oh yes," she nodded. "My husband and I had a retriever named Daisy. She lived to be 14. When he passed, I couldn't bring myself to have another. It felt like closing a chapter I wasn't ready to end." Ethan nodded slowly. "Maybe some chapters open themselves." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw what the city hadn't: the fatigue behind his stillness, the quiet ache in his posture. She didn't ask about it. Instead, she placed the puppy back beside its mother and said, "You're doing a good thing, Mr. Walker," he said. "Ethan Walker." "Well, Mr. Walker, if you need anything, extra blankets, food, I live just upstairs." "I'll remember that." As she stood, Hope, the mother dog, lifted her head and licked Eleanor's wrist. The older woman froze, then smiled again. "Thank you, dear," she whispered. "It's been a while since anyone trusted me that quickly." She turned toward the door, her scarf brushing against her cheek. Ethan walked her there, his usual reserve replaced by a quiet sincerity. "Thank you for the soup," he said. "Take care of them," she replied softly. They're not the only ones who need saving. When the door closed behind her, Ethan stood for a moment in the stillness. The firelight from the stove flickered across the room, casting a soft glow on the dogs huddled together and on the bowl of half-eaten soup on the counter. He turned back toward the heater. Eleanor's laughter still lingered faintly in his ears, mixing with the soft crackle of warmth. He knelt by the dogs, adjusting the blanket around them, and for the first time since returning from the war, he realized something unfamiliar had settled into the room. It was peace, fragile, quiet, but real. He looked toward the door, where Eleanor had just stood, then at the small family of dogs beside him. The firelight caught his expression, softening the edges of a man who'd forgotten how to smile. And when Hope rested her head on his knee, the faintest curve found his lips. The home, for once, didn't feel empty. It felt alive. The morning broke gray and thin over Brooklyn, the kind of pale winter light that looked like it had been strained through frost. Ethan stood outside the small veterinary clinic, tucked between a laundromat and a bakery, the faint smell of yeast and detergent mixing oddly in the air. He adjusted the hood of his worn navy jacket and glanced down at the 3 dogs waiting beside him. Hope sat obediently, her posture straight but cautious, her eyes following every passerby. Scout sniffed the snow-covered sidewalk with curiosity, his small tail wagging with bursts of bravery, while Tiny shivered beneath the wool blanket wrapped around him, his small body pressing against his mother's leg. The sign above the door read Maple Grove Veterinary Care, its paint cracked by years of weather. A bell chimed when Ethan pushed the door open. The warmth inside hit him like a wave, clean, bright, and faintly smelling of antiseptic. A woman behind the counter looked up with a welcoming smile. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with chestnut brown hair tied into a messy ponytail, freckles across a fair complexion, and a pair of clear, intelligent green eyes. Her name tag read Dr. Marissa Lane. "Good morning," she said, setting aside a clipboard. "How can we help you today?" Ethan nodded slightly. "I found them 2 nights ago, the mother and her pups. They were left in a cage on 5th Avenue. The warmth in Marissa's smile faltered, replaced by a shadow of concern. "Left in a cage? In this weather?" She came around the counter, her movements quick and purposeful. "Let's get them checked right away." She led him to a small exam room, walls painted a calming pale green. Ethan lifted Tiny first, then Scout, and finally Hope onto the table, one by one. The mother dog's gaze stayed locked on him, anxious, her ears twitching. "It's all right," Ethan murmured, keeping one hand on her back. Dr. Lane worked efficiently, her tone gentle as she examined each dog. She ran practiced hands over Hope's ribs, checked her teeth, and inspected the faint scar near her paw. "She's underweight," she said quietly, "and dehydrated, but her muscle tone's good, strong. She's been cared for at some point. Recently, maybe." She moved to the puppies. These 2 are about 5 weeks old. The smaller one's a bit weak, but nothing irreversible. You did the right thing bringing them in. Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly. "So, they'll be all right?" "With rest, warmth, and food, yes," she said. Then her brow furrowed as she pressed gently on Hope's abdomen. "But this?" She paused, glancing up at him. "You said they were abandoned? Not lost?" "They were left with a for sale sign," he replied grimly. Marissa sighed. "That fits." "Fits what?" She took off her gloves and rested both hands on the edge of the table. "This isn't the first case I've seen like this. The scar near her paw, that's from a binding rope. not an accident. And the way her milk glands are swollen, she's been overbred. Probably part of a backyard breeding operation. Ethan's jaw tightened. I mean, she said, lowering her voice. Someone was making money off her, breeding litter after litter, selling the pups cheap to avoid attention. When she couldn't produce as fast, they dumped her. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the overhead light. Ethan stared at the table, his fists curling slowly. Hope looked up at him, her eyes calm but searching, as if to remind him that anger wasn't what she needed right now. Protection was. "Do you know where?" he asked finally. "Who's behind it?" Marissa shook her head. "Not yet, but there's a pattern. Dogs like her show up every few months, always from the same parts of the city. The Bronx, sometimes Queens. There was a case last year. A whole breeding lot shut down after neighbors complained about the smell. The people running it just disappeared." Ethan's gaze sharpened. "Then they're still out there." "I'm afraid so." He exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb over the scar on his palm, a small mark he'd gotten years ago when a door blew open mid-operation in Kandahar. Back then, his mission had been to stop men who traded lives for power. This felt no different, just quieter, colder. Dr. Lane glanced at him. "I'll file a report. And if you're keeping them, I'll help with the vaccinations and food. But," she hesitated, "be careful, Mr. Walker," he said. "Ethan Walker." She nodded. "Be careful, Mr. Walker. The people who do this, they don't like attention." He met her gaze evenly. "Neither do I." A faint smile touched her lips, half admiration, half worry. "Still, promise me you won't go looking for them alone." "I'll think about it," he said, which wasn't a promise at all. He gathered the dogs gently into the blanket again. Before he left, Marissa crouched to meet Hope's eyes. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she said softly, stroking her muzzle. "You did good." Hope's ears flicked forward, and for the first time since that night on Fifth Avenue, she wagged her tail. Outside, the snow had begun again. Thin, silent flakes falling against the city's hum. Ethan walked slowly back to his truck, the air cold against his face. He wasn't used to this kind of anger anymore. The kind that burned quietly instead of exploding. He'd seen enough of human cruelty to know what it looked like, but seeing it turn toward something innocent reignited a fire he thought he'd buried with his uniform. Later that evening, in the apartment building across the street, Eleanor Pierce sat with her radio playing softly beside her. The evening news mentioned an uptick in illegal animal trade near the Bronx. She frowned and turned up the volume, listening. The report mentioned the same name she'd heard from her late husband's friend years ago. An old organization called the Petline Foundation, a volunteer rescue network for mistreated animals. The next morning, she knocked on Ethan's door. He opened it cautiously, still half tired. She stood there in her wool coat, holding a stack of papers. "I heard about your visit to the vet," she said. "One of the neighbors mentioned it. I think I can help." He raised an eyebrow. "Help?" Eleanor handed him one of the papers. It was an old flyer, edges yellowed with time, printed with a logo of a paw over a heart. The Petline Foundation, because every life deserves a second chance. "My husband used to donate to them," she explained. "They helped shut down an illegal breeding site in the Bronx years ago. Maybe they can do it again." Ethan studied the paper for a long moment. His fingers brushed the worn surface. "Thank you," he said quietly. She smiled. I know that look, Mr. Walker. My husband had it too. The one that says you're about to go do something dangerous for the right reasons. Ethan didn't deny it. He just folded the flyer and slipped it into his pocket. As Eleanor turned to leave, Hope padded up behind him, tail swaying gently. The older woman reached down to stroke her fur. Take care of her, she said softly. And yourself. He nodded. I intend to. When she was gone, Ethan stepped outside. The city looked softer in the snowfall, quieter. But beneath the stillness, he could feel the wrongness of what he'd learned settling deep into him. He looked down at Hope and murmured, no one deserves to be caged just for existing. And for the first time, the promise didn't feel like a thought. It felt like a mission. By late afternoon, the sky above Brooklyn had turned to iron. Clouds hung low and heavy, sagging with the promise of a storm that the radio had been warning about all morning. The wind picked up first, thin, sharp gusts that slashed down the narrow street like invisible knives. Then came the snow, thick and relentless, erasing color, sound, and distance. Within an hour, the world had become white and strange, as though the city had folded into silence. Inside his apartment, Ethan moved quickly. The old building groaned under the cold, the windows rattling with each new gust. He stacked the last of the firewood beside the stove, then spread his few remaining blankets over the couch and floor. Hope paced restlessly at his side, ears pricked, nose twitching toward the wind, whistling under the door. Scout and Tiny followed her closely, the bigger pup, clumsy but fearless, the smaller one trembling at every sound. When the lights flickered once and then went out, the room fell into darkness. For a heartbeat, there was only the low whine of the wind outside and the faint scratch of branches against the window. Ethan didn't swear, didn't sigh, just moved to light the small kerosene lamp on the table. The yellow glow filled the room with a fragile warmth, casting long, soft shadows against the walls. All right, he said quietly, half to himself, half to them. Looks like we're on our own tonight. He knelt by the heater and fed kindling into it until the flame caught. Soon, the faint crackle of fire replaced the hum of electricity, and a thin ribbon of smoke curled up through the vent. The smell of burning wood mixed with the faint scent of damp fur. He spread an old army blanket across the floor, then gestured to Hope. Come on, girl, over here. She obeyed, moving with that wary grace that seemed bred into her bones. Her ribs still showed faintly through her fur, but she held herself with quiet dignity. When Scout and Tiny settled against her belly, she lowered her head over them like a shield. Ethan sat beside them, his back against the wall, the warmth of the fire brushing his legs. For a while, no one moved. Outside, the storm grew louder, a steady roar that swallowed every other sound. Snow piled against the window in uneven ridges, muffling the city's heartbeat. Ethan listened to the rhythm of breathing beside him, the slow, steady pulse of life. Hope's breath was deeper now, calmer, while the pup's tiny chests rose and fell in sync. He closed his eyes. It was a sound he hadn't realized he'd missed, the simple certainty of something alive and safe. Hours passed. The clock on the wall had stopped ticking. The temperature dropped again, and Ethan could see his breath in thin wisps of white. He reached for another blanket, pulled it around his shoulders, and lay down beside the dogs. Hope shifted closer, her warmth pressing against his arm. He remembered the desert again, the endless nights when cold settled into his bones, when the only comfort was the weight of his rifle beside him and the sound of someone breathing in the next cot. But this was different. There was no mission, no enemy, no noise of distant mortar fire, just stillness, just warmth. He was drifting towards sleep when a soft knock sounded on the door. 3 gentle taps, then silence. He frowned, sat up, and crossed the room. When he opened the door, a rush of snow blew in, followed by a faint yellow glow. Standing there in the hall was Eleanor Pierce, wrapped in a thick wool coat and holding an old oil lantern. Her hair was tucked beneath a knitted cap, snowflakes clinging to the strands that had escaped. In her other hand, she carried a small basket. "I saw your lights go out," she said, her voice trembling slightly from the cold. "The whole block's out. I thought I'd check in on you." Ethan blinked. "You walked over here? In this?" "I've seen worse," she said, with a faint smile. "Besides, I didn't come empty-handed." She lifted the basket. Soup and bread, still warm. He stepped aside immediately. "Come in before you freeze." She entered carefully, setting the lantern on the table. Its light mingled with the glow of his own lamp, turning the room gold. She looked around and smiled softly when she saw the dogs huddled by the fire. My goodness, they look like they've found paradise. "Better than a cage," Ethan said. Eleanor removed her gloves and rubbed her hands together. "So this is what your generation calls roughing it." Her tone was teasing, but kind. Ethan smirked faintly. "We've had worse setups in the field." "I imagine," she said, "but at least now you've got better company." Hope lifted her head as Eleanor approached, tail thumping softly against the floor. Scout barked once, a quick, uncertain sound, but stopped when Ethan raised a hand. Eleanor crouched down, her knees popping audibly. "Hello there," she said gently. "You must be the brave one." She reached out slowly, letting Hope sniff her fingers before giving her a gentle scratch behind the ear. "And these two," she said, smiling as the puppies stirred, "are your little miracles." "They've earned their names," Ethan said. "Hope, Scout, and Tiny. They suit them." For a while, they talked in low voices, sharing soup from the same pot. The warmth from the fire deepened, the small space filled with the faint sound of wind and crackling wood. Eleanor told him about the winter she and her husband had spent without power back in 1978, how they'd played cards by candlelight and made jokes to keep from worrying. She laughed at the memory, and the sound lit something inside the room, something brighter than fire. "You know," she said after a pause, "you remind me of him sometimes. My Richard. He had that same look in his eyes when he brought home that stray retriever all those years ago. Like he needed to save something in order to keep himself from breaking." Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, its light flickering across the hard lines of his face. "Maybe he did," he said finally. "Maybe that's what we all do. Try to save something small when we can't fix the big things." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And sometimes," she said, "the small things save us instead." The wind howled outside, shaking the window frames. The lamp flame danced wildly for a moment before steadying again. Hope stretched, pressing her nose against Ethan's arm. He looked down, smiling faintly. "Yeah," he murmured. "Maybe they do." Eleanor watched him quietly, her expression soft. "You're not alone anymore, you know." He glanced up at her, caught off guard. "I mean it," she continued. "This building, it's old, but it's full of people who care. You should let them." "I'll try," he said, though his voice sounded uncertain even to himself. "That's all any of us can do." They fell into a comfortable silence. The fire crackled. Snow beat softly against the window. Scout yawned, curling into his mother's belly, and Tiny's tiny paw rested against Ethan's knee. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, lantern light painting gold across her face. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt shared, earned. The storm outside raged for hours, the wind battering against brick and glass, but inside, warmth gathered like breath. By the time midnight came, the fire had burned low, and the lamplight dimmed to a faint amber glow. Hope slept with her muzzle resting on Ethan's leg. Her pups nestled close. Eleanor had dozed off in the armchair, her scarf still around her neck, her face peaceful. Ethan adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, then lay back on the floor beside the dogs. The last embers flickered in the stove, throwing faint, shifting patterns of light on the ceiling. For the first time in years, he felt the deep, unfamiliar comfort of belonging. Not to a mission, not to a uniform, but to a moment. Outside, the storm continued its fury. But inside, 3 dogs and 2 lonely souls slept beneath the same fragile roof, bound together by the simplest kind of warmth, the kind that came from trust. The morning after, the storm rose quiet and pale, a stillness that felt almost sacred. Snow blanketed the streets of Brooklyn like a white shroud, softening the edges of cars, trees, and old brick buildings. The storm had passed, but the air still held its bite, cold enough to sting the lungs. Inside his apartment, Ethan woke to the sound of tiny paws scurrying across the floor. Scout was chasing a bit of string he'd found, while Tiny stumbled after him in clumsy determination. Hope lay near the stove, eyes half closed, the slow rhythm of her breathing blending with the gentle crackle of the rekindled fire. For a few minutes, Ethan allowed himself to simply watch them. It was strange how easily peace could settle into a place when the world outside had gone silent. He poured himself a cup of black coffee from the tin pot on the counter, steam rising into the frosted air, and rubbed his temples. The night had been long, but not lonely. He hadn't realized until now how deeply he had missed sharing quiet with someone, or something. He pulled on his coat and opened the door to fetch a breath of cold air. That was when he saw it. The footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the snow right outside his door. Not the small, scattered prints of a neighbor, but heavy ones. Men's boots, treads wide and deliberate. There were 2 sets, both leading up to his door, both ending there. None led away. Ethan crouched down, studying them closely. His military instincts kicked in without thought. Weight distribution, direction, depth. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They had stopped, stood, maybe listened. The snow from the night before had covered most tracks in the area, yet these were clean, crisp, new. He straightened slowly, scanning the hallway. The air felt different now, thicker somehow, quieter. He looked toward the end of the corridor, where dim light filtered through the cracked window. Nothing moved, but something in his chest tightened, a familiar tension he hadn't felt since deployment. When he closed the door again, Hope had risen to her feet, tail low, hackles slightly raised. She looked at him, then at the door, and let out a single low growl, soft but certain. "Yeah," Ethan muttered. "I saw them too." He crossed the room and drew the curtains halfway. For the first time since he'd brought them home, the apartment didn't feel like a refuge. It felt exposed. After a moment of thought, he picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He'd added the local police station number the week before, after Dr. Lane had warned him about the illegal breeders. He hesitated only a second before dialing. "Brooklyn, 75th Precinct. This is Officer Turner," came a steady voice on the other end. "Morning," Ethan said, his tone level. "My name's Ethan Walker. I think someone came by my apartment last night. I'm fostering a few dogs that might have been part of an animal trafficking case." There was a pause. Then, "Did you see anyone?" "No," he said, "but I've got boot prints outside my door. 2 sets. Deep ones. Fresh." "Address?" He gave it, and the officer promised to send someone for a report. Still, Ethan could tell from the tone, calm but uninterested, that this was routine to them, another small incident in a city full of noise. When the call ended, he stood still, staring at the phone. His instincts told him this wasn't random. Someone knew where he lived. He turned toward Hope, who was watching him carefully, her dark eyes reflecting the dim morning light. "They're not taking you back," he said quietly. "Not now. Not ever." Across the hall, Eleanor Pierce sat by her window with a wool shawl draped over her shoulders, a cup of tea growing cold in her hand. She had hardly slept. When the power returned before dawn, she'd seen movement through the snow, 2 shadows lingering near Ethan's door before vanishing into the storm. She hadn't wanted to believe it was anything sinister, but the image clung to her. Now, as she looked toward the faint light coming from his window, she felt the unease growing stronger. By mid-morning, she gathered her courage, put on her coat, and made her way down the hall. Her steps were careful, her hand steady on the rail. When Ethan opened the door, she saw the tightness in his expression before he spoke a word. "You saw them too, didn't you?" he asked softly. Eleanor hesitated, her face pale. Yes, last night, during the storm. I thought it was just paranoia. 2 men, I think. They were standing right where you are now." He nodded, jaw clenching. "You should have called me." "I didn't want to wake you," she said quietly, guilt flickering across her face. "And maybe I wanted to believe it wasn't real. I've spent so many years not having anything to worry about. Then you came along, and suddenly I remembered what it feels like to care whether someone makes it through the night." Ethan's sternness softened. "You shouldn't have to worry about that." "Oh, but that's the point, isn't it?" she said with a faint smile. "When you stop worrying, you stop living. Maybe this fear means I'm alive again." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Maybe it does." They spent the next hour waiting for the police to arrive. Officer Turner turned out to be a man in his early 40s, tall and broad, with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much and still believed it was his job to keep order. His uniform was neat despite the slush on his boots, and a trimmed beard framed his square jaw. "Morning," he said as he stepped in, shaking snow off his shoulders. "You're the one who called?" Ethan nodded, motioning to the doorway. The tracks were right there. Turner crouched to examine them, his expression unreadable. "Looks like you're right. 2 men. Probably boots, with thick tread, military or work style. Could have been maintenance crew, though." Ethan folded his arms. Maintenance crew doesn't stand outside someone's door at midnight. Turner gave a small nod. "Fair point." He took a few photos with his phone, then turned back to Ethan. "You said you're fostering dogs that might be tied to a case?" "Yeah. The vet confirmed the mother's been overbred. Could be from one of those Bronx operations." The officer's expression changed slightly, interest mixed with concern. "I'll make a note of it. You did the right thing calling this in." He closed his notebook and glanced around the small apartment, eyes settling briefly on the 3 dogs by the fire. "Cute bunch," he said softly. "You've got a good heart, Mr. Walker. Just be careful who finds out about it." When he left, Eleanor lingered near the door, her lantern still burning softly. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the window, snow swirling outside like dust in a forgotten dream. "If they do, they'll regret it." She smiled faintly, though worry shadowed her eyes. "I believe that." That evening, as the light faded and the wind began to whisper again, Ethan sat by the window. The city glowed faintly beneath a sheet of snow, streetlights hazy in the drifting white. Hope lay beside him, her head resting on his knee, her breath slow and steady. He reached down, fingers brushing through her fur, and spoke so quietly the words almost disappeared into the storm. "I'll protect you. All of you. No one's taking you away again." Outside, the snow began to fall heavier, erasing the footprints that had frightened them that morning. The world turned silent once more, but inside, beneath the dim lamp, there was something unspoken yet sure. A promise made and meant. The city had gone back to pretending nothing had happened. Snowplows had carved narrow paths through the frozen streets, and commuters shuffled along sidewalks, shoulders hunched against the wind, unaware that in the quiet corners of Brooklyn, something far uglier than the cold still lingered. Ethan Walker didn't pretend. He'd learned long ago that evil didn't disappear when ignored. It just waited for nightfall. He stood by the window of his apartment. The lights dimmed. The room bathed in the soft glow of the heater. Hope lay at his feet, her eyes half open but alert, while the 2 pups, Scout and Tiny, slept curled into the blanket near the fire. Outside, the world was painted in shades of blue and silver. The street below was nearly empty, except for the occasional rumble of a distant car. Then, just after midnight, a sound broke the stillness, the low growl of an engine pulling to a stop. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He moved closer to the window, careful not to cast a shadow against the glass. Parked just beyond the streetlight was a dark van, its paint dulled with grime, tires still crusted with snow. No markings, no logos, just black metal and silence. His pulse slowed, not sped up, old instincts taking hold. He watched as 2 men climbed out, both wearing thick coats and gloves. The taller one kept glancing up at the building. The other opened the van's rear doors. Inside, even in the dim light, Ethan could see the metal cages stacked along the walls. He pulled his phone from his pocket and took several pictures, zooming in on the license plate. His jaw tightened as he noted the details. Then he slipped on his coat and boots. "Stay," he told Hope quietly. She whined but obeyed, pressing closer to the pups. Down the stairwell, Ethan moved like a shadow. Each step was deliberate, silent. His time as a SEAL hadn't left him. It had simply gone quiet, waiting for a moment like this. Outside, the air hit his face like ice, but he barely felt it. He ducked behind a parked car and observed. The taller man, blonde hair under a beanie, beard rough and uneven, was arguing with someone on a phone. His voice was low but agitated. The second, shorter man, kept scanning the area nervously, his breath visible in the air. They looked like the kind who'd been doing this a while. Careful but cocky. Men who thought no one cared enough to stop them. "You sure this is the place?" the blonde one muttered. "Yeah," the other replied. "Boss said the guy's got one of the females we lost last month. She's worth good money. Get her, And the pups too. He won't fight back. Nobody does. Ethan's expression didn't change, but a cold, clean focus settled over him. He moved along the edge of the building until he was behind them. Then he waited. The blond man pulled a small crowbar from his coat and started toward the entrance. Ethan stepped out of the shadows. "You're lost." Both men froze. The shorter one turned first, his eyes widening when he saw Ethan's stance. Calm, balanced, unmoving. There was something in the man's bearing that didn't belong to a civilian. "Who the hell are you?" the blond one demanded. "Someone who's had enough of people like you," Ethan said evenly. The man sneered and took a step forward. "Look, pal, mind your business." Ethan didn't answer. When the man raised the crowbar, Ethan moved, a blur of motion honed by years of training. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted sharply, and sent the tool clattering into the snow. The second man lunged, but Ethan turned, using his momentum against him, sending him sprawling to the ground with a heavy thud. The blond man staggered back, clutching his wrist. "You're dead, man," he spat, reaching for something in his pocket. Ethan kicked forward, striking the man's arm. A knife skidded across the pavement. He pinned him against the van. "You don't get to hurt anything again," Ethan said quietly, his breath steady despite the adrenaline. "Not her. Not anyone." At that moment, flashing blue lights swept across the street. Officer Turner stepped out of his cruiser, gun drawn, his voice firm. "NYPD, hands where I can see them." The shorter man tried to bolt, but Turner was faster, slamming him against the hood. The blonde raised his hands, cursing under his breath. Within seconds, the scene was surrounded. Another patrol car pulled up, headlights cutting through the snow. "Walker," Turner called, recognition flashing across his face. "You again." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Told you they'd come back." Turner holstered his weapon and signaled his partner to cuff the suspects. "Looks like you were right. You got pictures?" Ethan nodded, handing over his phone. "License plate, faces, cages, everything." "Good," Turner said. "We'll tie this to the Bronx case. You might have just given us enough to shut down the whole ring." Ethan stepped back, watching as the men were loaded into the cruiser, their curses muffled by the wind. When Turner approached again, his expression softened. "You know," he said, "most people would have stayed upstairs and called it in." "Most people don't owe the world this much," Ethan replied. Turner nodded once. "You did good tonight." Then, glancing toward the van, he added, "We'll get the rest of the dogs out. Some of them look bad, but they'll make it. People like you. Make sure they do." When the sirens faded into the distance, silence returned. Thicker now, but peaceful. Snow began to fall again, thin flakes drifting down like ash. Ethan stood for a long moment, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a quiet ache in his chest. Across the street, a curtain fluttered. In the soft light of her apartment, Eleanor Pierce stood by her window, one hand over her mouth. She'd seen it all. The fight, the arrests, the flashing lights cutting through the night. Her eyes shone with tears she didn't bother to hide. For years, she had watched the world grow colder, crueler. But tonight, as the last patrol car disappeared down the street, she felt something she hadn't felt since her husband's days in uniform. Faith. Faith that decency hadn't vanished. That courage still existed. She whispered, "He did it." And the words felt like a prayer. Later, Ethan climbed the stairs back to his apartment. His hands were red from the cold. his muscles heavy but calm. When he opened the door, Hope was waiting by the fire, her head lifting the instant he entered. The pup stirred and yawned. He knelt beside them, letting Hope press her muzzle against his hand. Her fur was warm beneath his palm, her eyes soft and knowing. "It's over," he murmured. "You're safe now." Scout barked once, a sharp, joyful sound, while Tiny tried to climb onto Ethan's leg, his small paws slipping on the floor. Ethan laughed softly for the first time in months, scooping the puppy up. Behind him, the city stretched quiet and endless, the night air still cold. But inside, something had shifted. The darkness that had followed him home from war finally felt a little lighter. He sat by the fire, both pups cradled in his arms, Hope leaning against his knee. The snow outside fell thicker, blanketing the city once more. But for Ethan Walker, warmth had finally found its way back. Winter began to loosen its grip on the city. The snowbanks shrank into slush along the curbs. The sound of dripping water replaced the crunch of ice, and for the first time in months, sunlight poured through the gray. Yet for Ethan Walker, the season's true thaw had already come and gone. The night the black van was taken away, and with it, the shadow that had been following him since the day he brought Hope home. A week after the arrests, Ethan's name appeared in the Brooklyn Gazette. The article was small, tucked between pieces about local politics and a story about a lost cat found after 12 days. But the headline carried quietly across the city. Former Navy SEAL rescues abandoned dogs, helps expose animal trafficking ring. They had used a photograph the police had taken after the incident. Ethan standing beside Officer Turner near the van, snow falling around them, Hope peeking from behind his leg. The journalist, a woman named Linda Crow, had done her research. She'd even called to ask if he wanted to share a statement. He'd said no, only adding, "I didn't save them. They saved me." Still, people began leaving small tokens at his building entrance. Dog blankets, notes that read, "Thank you for caring," even a box of biscuits wrapped in red ribbon. Ethan didn't seek attention, but the kindness warmed something quiet in him. The world, he realized, still noticed when someone did good. It just needed reminding. He spent most of his days at home now, working on repairs around the building for the landlord, who refused to take rent for the month as thanks for what Ethan had done. Hope's paw had healed nicely, her fur regaining its sheen under proper food and rest. Scout had grown mischievous, always finding new things to chew. Shoelaces, wooden chair legs, even Eleanor's scarf one morning. Tiny, still smaller than his brother, had become the gentle one, content to curl in Ethan's lap for hours while he read by the window. It wasn't long before he made the decision official. He signed the adoption papers at Maple Grove Veterinary Clinic, where Dr. Marissa Lane beamed with pride as she handed him the forms. They couldn't have found a better home, she told him. Her eyes lingered on Hope and the pups before meeting his again. "You know, Mr. Walker, animals always find the people who need them most." He smiled faintly. Then they did their job. That evening, he stopped by Eleanor Pierce's apartment with the news. She was sitting in her armchair, wrapped in a maroon shawl, reading an old copy of Little Women. When he told her he had adopted all 3 dogs, her face lit up like a lantern. "I knew you would," she said. "Men like you can't just save something and walk away. You need to see it live." Ethan chuckled softly. "You sound like my commanding officer." She grinned. Then he must have been a wise man. A few weeks later, When spring's first sunlight reached the frozen trees, Eleanor surprised him again. She had sold her larger apartment across town and moved into a smaller one just 2 floors below his. "It's silly for an old woman to live alone when there's a kettle waiting upstairs," she said simply when he asked why. From that day, the evenings followed a gentle rhythm. Around 4 o'clock, Ethan would leash the dogs, Hope walking steady beside him, Scout tugging with youthful energy, Tiny trotting close to his boots. And together, they would stroll through Prospect Park, the same park where the story had begun. The air there still carried the faint hum of winter, the grass damp beneath patches of snow. But life had returned. Families played, children laughed, and sometimes strangers stopped to pet the dogs and say, "You're the man from the paper, aren't you?" Ethan would only smile and nod. At home, Eleanor would join him for tea around dusk. She'd bring fresh scones from the bakery downstairs, while he brewed the strong black tea she claimed reminded her of her husband. Their conversations drifted from the past to the present, stories of her teaching years and his deployments, tales that began in deserts and ended in quiet corners of Brooklyn. Hope would rest near the window, keeping watch over the city like a sentry who finally knew she was safe. The pups wrestled nearby, their small barks filling the space with life. More than once, Eleanor found herself laughing so hard she had to wipe her eyes. "I never thought I'd hear laughter echo in these halls again," she said one evening. "That's what happens when you share your home," Ethan replied. "It gives the walls a heartbeat." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You sound like a man who's found his peace." He paused, glancing at the dogs. "Maybe I just stopped running from it." Outside, spring snow began to fall again, thin and fleeting, melting as it touched the ground. The city glowed under the street lamps, soft and alive. Ethan stood by the window, hands resting on the frame, his reflection faint in the glass. The man who stared back no longer looked haunted. The lines on his face were still there, but they carried something new: acceptance. On the wall behind him hung a small wooden frame. Inside it, pressed under glass, was the faded for sale sign he had taken from the cage months ago. The ink had blurred from moisture, the cardboard rough and torn at the edges, yet it stood there now, between photos of Hope and her puppies, a quiet reminder of everything he'd fought for. One evening, Eleanor came up with her camera, a small vintage Polaroid that had belonged to her husband. "We should take a picture," she said, "something to prove that happy endings aren't just for books." He laughed, agreeing reluctantly. She positioned him by the window, the fading light framing his shoulders. Ethan wore his old navy jacket, the fabric faded but neat. Hope sat beside him, her head high, the 2 pups curled at his boots. Eleanor stood just behind them, her hand resting gently on the doorframe, smiling softly. The camera clicked. When the photo printed, Eleanor shook it gently, waiting for the image to appear. Slowly, colors emerged: the soft glow of dusk, the warm tones of the fire, the reflection of peace. She handed it to Ethan. "There," she said, "that's what home looks like." He looked down at it for a long time, then smiled. For the first time since leaving the Navy, he felt like he'd arrived somewhere he didn't have to leave. Not a mission, not a place to recover, but a life. The dogs slept soundly that night. Eleanor hummed an old tune in the kitchen as she brewed tea, and Ethan, sitting beside the fire, reached out to touch the old for sale sign one more time. Its rough edges bit softly against his fingers, but the words it once carried no longer meant loss. They meant belonging. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, in the shape of a wounded dog, a stranger's kindness, or a moment when the heart remembers how to care again. Ethan didn't set out to find a miracle, but one found him, just as grace often finds those who stop long enough to listen. Maybe that's what faith truly is, the belief that love still moves through the world, even when it hides beneath the cold. If you believe that compassion is never wasted, that every act of kindness ripples farther than we can see, share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to our channel to keep these miracles alive. May God bless you and every soul that still chooses love over indifference.